groan of old steel was the first sound of the morning, and often the last sound at night. For Arthur Miller, it was the sound of solvency. It was the sound of a life lived without a banker's signature on his soul. That particular May morning in 1974, the groan came from the clutch pedal of his 1951 Farmall M. It was a complaint deep in the tractor's iron guts, a tired sigh he'd been hearing for a week but ignoring because the South 80 still needed planting and the sky was threatening rain. He pushed the pedal to the floor, the muscles in his left leg bunching like rope. The transmission gears gnashed with a sound like grinding teeth before the shifter reluctantly slid into third. He eased the clutch out, feeding power from the four-cylinder gasoline engine, and the old tractor lurched forward, pulling the four-row John Deere planter behind it. The dry, black Iowa soil crumbled and parted, accepting the seed corn he'd paid for with cash money earned the previous fall. Each pass across the field was a meditation in mechanics. Art could read the tractor like a book written in smoke and sound. The steady, rhythmic pop, pop, pop from the exhaust stack told him the carburetor was set just right. The needle on the temperature gauge, hovering just a hair below the red, told him the radiator fins were getting clogged with chaff again. The way the steering wheel had a quarter turn of slop in it was a conversation he'd been having with the worn steering shaft for a decade. He knew its every mood, its every weakness. He'd rebuilt the engine himself, sleeves and pistons, in the winter of '68. He'd patched a crack in the manifold with furnace cement and baling wire just last month. The tractor wasn't a machine. It was a testament to the fact that a man could make his way in this world with his own two hands and what he owned outright. As he reached the end of a long row, he pulled back on the throttle and stood on the brakes, turning the big machine in a wide, careful arc on the headland. That's when he saw the cloud of dust on the gravel road. It wasn't a neighborly cloud, stirred up by a slow-moving pickup. This was an arrogant cloud, a plume of aggression kicked up by someone in a hurry. The dust settled to reveal a brand-new, gleaming Chevrolet Silverado, the color of a summer sky. It pulled to a stop, and Richard Peterson stepped out. Peterson was everything Art was not. His jeans were clean, creased. His boots looked like they'd never seen the inside of a hog pen. He leaned against the shiny fender of his truck, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Behind him, in his own field, sat the reason for his smirk, a John Deere 4630, its enclosed cab shining in the sun, its 8-bottom plough looking big enough to turn over half the county in a single pass. It was parked, but even at rest it seemed to hum with potential, with the power of borrowed money. "Mornin', Art," Peterson called out, his voice carrying easily over the Farmall's idle. "Having a little trouble there? Sounded like you were grinding a new set of gears." Art shut the tractor off. The sudden silence was punctuated by the ticking of the hot manifold. "She's just talking to me, Rich. It's an old tractor thing. You wouldn't understand." Peterson chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Yeah, I guess I wouldn't. My 4630 doesn't talk, it just works. Put in more corn yesterday than you'll get in all week with that museum piece." He gestured vaguely at the Farmall. "You know, the bank is offering operating loans at 7%. You could trade that thing in, get yourself a real tractor. Farm like it's 1974, not 1944. This tractor's paid for, Rich. So is this land. That means the bank doesn't get a vote on how I farm it." Art's hands, stained with grease and dirt, tightened on the steering wheel. He hated this conversation. He hated the easy confidence of men like Peterson, men who saw debt not as a chain, but as a tool. "Suit yourself," Peterson shrugged, already losing interest. "Some of us are trying to grow. Just closed on the old Henderson place yesterday. Gonna need a bigger planter next year." Maybe a second tractor, just like that one. He patted the hood of his new pickup. Can't make money sitting still, Art. Gotta get big or get out. You know that. He got back in his truck and roared off, leaving Art in a renewed cloud of dust and quiet fury. Get big or get out. It was the new gospel, preached from the pages of Farm Journal and whispered by the loan officers in town. It was a gospel Art Miller refused to believe. He believed in thrift. He believed in patience. He believed that a man's net worth wasn't measured by the size of his equipment, but by the shortness of his list of creditors. An hour later, his daughter Sarah's Ford Falcon bumped along the edge of the field, bringing him lunch. She got out with a wicker basket and a jug of iced tea, her face a mixture of love and concern. She was a good girl, smart, with her mother's eyes. She'd done a year of business school in Des Moines before coming home after her mother passed, and she kept the farm's books with a precision that impressed even Art. "How's it going, Dad?" she asked, handing him a sandwich. "Slow," Art grunted, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag. "Clutch is about to give up the ghost, and I just had a visit from the prophet of progress himself." Sarah sighed. "Mr. Peterson told me I ought to go into debt to buy a new tractor. Told me he bought the Henderson place." "I know," Sarah said quietly, looking down at her shoes. "I saw it in the paper. He's farming nearly 1,000 acres now." She looked at her father, at the deep lines etched around his eyes, the permanent stoop in his shoulders. She saw the tremor of exhaustion in his hands as he unwrapped his sandwich. "Dad, maybe he's not wrong. Not about going into debt, but about updating. You work so hard, from before sunrise to after sunset. This tractor, it's killing you. This tractor fed you, Sarah. It put you through school. It owes me nothing, and I owe nobody for it. That's a feeling men like Rich Peterson will never know. But what's the point of being debt-free if you work yourself into an early grave?" Her voice was pleading. "The dealer in town is having a sale. They've got those new 4430s. With a cab, Dad, air conditioning, a radio. You wouldn't come in at night so deaf from the engine you can't hear the television. We have the money for a down payment. A good one. Our credit is perfect. We have that money because we don't spend it on things we don't need," Art said, his voice hard. "The answer is no. We'll get by with what we have. Now, I've got to get back to it before that sky opens up." He finished his lunch in silence, the tension a palpable thing between them. Sarah watched him climb back onto the iron seat of the farmel, his movements stiff and slow. She watched him fight with the gears, watched the old tractor belch a puff of blue smoke and crawl back into the field. And in that moment, a seed of desperation, planted by love and fear, took root in her heart. She couldn't watch him do this for another year. She just couldn't. 2 days later, she drove the Falcon into town. She didn't go to the grocery store or the post office. She parked right in front of the green and yellow sign of the John Deere dealership. Inside, the air smelled of new paint and rubber. A young, eager salesman named Tim approached her. She told him who she was. The Miller name still meant something in that county. It meant honesty. It meant their word was their bond. She walked with Tim through the showroom, past gleaming green behemoths that made her father's farmel look like a garden toy. She pointed to a John Deere 4430, the 125 horsepower heart of a modern farm. "Mr. Peterson just bought 2 4630s, Tim said, polishing an imaginary smudge off the hood. "But this 4430 is our most popular model, a real workhorse." "I think," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest, "that we're going to need 2 of them. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you all, Was Art right to be so stubborn? To refuse progress even when it was offered as a way to ease his own burden? Or was Sarah right to try and pull her father into the modern age, to trade a little bit of debt for a chance at a longer, healthier life for the man she loved? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, because what happens next, the phone call that changed everything, was born from that single, headstrong decision made in a John Deere showroom. The phone rang in the farmhouse kitchen a week later. It was an old black rotary phone, heavy and solid. Art picked it up, his knuckles still raw from trying to adjust the farmel's clutch linkage. "Miller Residence," he said. "Art. Tim Johnson over at the dealership. Just calling with some great news. Your daughter Sarah, she's a gem, you know that? A real gem." Art frowned. "What about Sarah?" "Well, I'm just finalizing the financing paperwork with the bank, and the delivery truck is all scheduled. We should have your 2 new 4430s out to your place first thing Friday morning. I just needed to confirm, will you be paying the delivery fee separately, or do you want us to roll that into the loan?" The silence on the line was as heavy as a cast-iron engine block. Art could hear the blood pounding in his ears. 2 new 4430s. The loan. Delivery. The words spun in his head, a cyclone of betrayal and disbelief. "There's been a mistake," Art said, his voice dangerously low. "A mistake? No, I've got the purchase order right here, signed by Sarah Miller. 2 John Deere 4430s, with the sound guard cabs, dual hydraulics, the works. She put down a real healthy chunk of cash, said it was a surprise for you." Art closed his eyes. He could picture it, Sarah taking the savings, the money he'd painstakingly put away from 3 good years of harvests, the nest egg he was saving for the lean years he knew were always coming, and handing it to this slick-haired salesman for a down payment on a debt that would hang over their heads for a decade. "It's a mistake," Art repeated, his voice like flint. "We're not buying any tractors." "But, Art, the paperwork is nearly through. The bank's already approved it based on your assets. This is a big sale for us." "Then you'll have to unsell it. Cancel the order. My daughter had no authority to make that purchase." He hung up the phone without waiting for a reply, the click of the receiver echoing in the silent kitchen. Sarah came in from the garden a few minutes later, humming to herself. When she saw the look on her father's face, the humming died in her throat. "The dealership called," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which was far worse than shouting. "About the 2 new tractors you ordered. About the loan you took out in my name." Her face went pale. "Dad, I was going to tell you. It was a surprise. I just wanted to help. I can't stand watching you kill yourself on that old M." "You didn't help," he said, turning to face her fully. "You went behind my back. You took our savings, the only cushion we have against a bad year or a hospital bill, and you gave it to the bank. You chained us to them. For what? For a shiny new tractor with a radio." "For you!" she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "So you can farm without pain. So you can have a future. Everyone is expanding. Everyone is modernizing. Peterson is buying up the county while you are patching together a 30-year-old tractor with baling wire." "Let Peterson have the county," Art's voice finally rose, a crack of thunder in the small kitchen. "And when the prices drop and the interest rates climb and the bank owns every acre he's bought, we'll still be here. Because this farm, this house, that old tractor, they are ours. Mine. Not the bank's. I've spent my entire life making sure of that one thing. It was the one thing my father taught me that mattered. You don't borrow for depreciating assets. You just don't." He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. "I cancelled the order, Sarah." She stared at him, horrified. "You what? Dad, you can't. They'll all laugh at us. Tim, the salesman, the bank, Mr. Peterson. Everyone in town will know. They'll say you're a fool." "Let them laugh," Art said, his voice quiet again. "I'd rather be a solvent fool than a respected slave. Now I've got a clutch to replace." He stood up and walked out the back door, heading for the machine shed, leaving Sarah alone with her tears and the weight of public humiliation that was about to descend upon their family. The story spread through the county like thistledown on the wind. Art Miller, the man who was so tight he squeaked, had a daughter who tried to buy him 2 brand-new John Deeres, and he'd called up and cancelled. At the co-op, men stopped talking when he walked in. At the diner, he'd catch the whispers and the pitying looks over the rims of coffee cups. Rich Peterson saw him one day, fueling up his old pickup, and swaggered over. "Heard you almost joined the 20th century, Art," Peterson said with a loud laugh that turned heads. "What happened? Your girl get a little too ambitious for your wallet?" Art just finished pumping his goss, screwed the cap on, and looked Peterson dead in the eye. "Some of us prefer to own what we drive, Rich." He paid the attendant in cash and drove away, Peterson's laughter following him down the street. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but the reality was worse. The Farmall's clutch wasn't just worn, it was shot. The pressure plate was warped, and 3 of the springs were broken. The throw-out bearing sounded like a can full of rocks. It wasn't a simple adjustment. It was a major operation. He had to split the tractor. For 3 days, the machine shed became his surgical theatre. He blocked up the front end of the tractor with heavy oak timbers. Using a rolling floor jack under the transmission, he began the slow, greasy process of unbolting the engine from the torque tube. The bolts were massive, rusted tight after decades of service. He strained on a 3-foot breaker bar, his knuckles scraping against the cast-iron housing, the smell of penetrating oil sharp in his nostrils. Finally, with a groan of protest, the 2 halves of the tractor separated. He rolled the engine and front axle forward, revealing the dark, oily cavern of the bell housing. Inside was the clutch assembly, a heavy, intricate piece of machinery that was the heart of the tractor's power. He wrestled it out, the assembly weighing nearly 100 pounds. His back screamed in protest. This was the work Sarah had tried to save him from. The irony was as heavy as the pressure plate in his hands. He took the parts to town, laying them out on the counter of the implement store like a surgeon presenting diseased organs. The parts man, a kid barely out of high school, had to look everything up in a dusty, finger-smudged catalogue. "Gonna have to order the pressure plate, Mr. Miller," the kid said. "Might take a week. Nobody really stocks parts for the M anymore." A week. A week of dry weather. A week of perfect planting conditions. Wasted. A week that Rich Peterson would use to get another 100 acres in the ground. Art felt a cold knot of despair tighten in his gut, but his face remained a stony mask. "Order it," he said, and walked out. He spent that week working on his John Deere 4020, his newer, bigger tractor, but one that was still 15 years old. He changed the oil, greased every fitting, cleaned the fuel injectors. It was a good, reliable machine, but it was too heavy for planting the wet spots in the South 80, and it burned twice the fuel of the Farmall. It was a compromise, and Art Miller hated compromises. When the parts for the Farmall finally arrived, he worked late into the night under the single bare bulb of the machine shed, reassembling the clutch with the care of a watchmaker. He cleaned every part, checked every tolerance, torqued every bolt to spec. He slid the 2 halves of the tractor back together, a delicate and dangerous dance of man and machine, using pry bars and curses to line up the splens of the input shaft. By the time he was done, it was nearly 2 in the morning, and every muscle in his body felt like it had been put through a wringer. He got his corn planted, but he was 10 days behind everyone else. The crop came up unevenly, and an early dry spell in June stunted its growth. It was going to be a mediocre year, at best. Every time he drove past Peterson's fields, the sight of the uniform, chest-high stalks of corn was a fresh jab of reproach. The latter half of the 1970s arrived on a wave of prosperity that threatened to prove Art Miller wrong about everything. The Russian grain deal had opened up a massive new market. Commodity prices, which had been steady for years, suddenly shot for the moon. Corn went from $1.50 a bushel to $3, then $3.50. Soybeans followed suit. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a living. It was a gold rush. Inflation was rampant, but for farmers with land, it was a blessing in disguise. Land values doubled, then tripled. A farmer's net worth, on paper, exploded. The banks, flush with cash, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The new, younger loan officer, who had replaced old Mr. Henderson at the First National Bank in town, was the high priest of this new religion. His gospel was leverage. Use your skyrocketing equity to borrow more, to buy more land, to buy bigger equipment, to plant fence row to fence row. The government was saying it, the banks were saying it, and the farm magazines were shouting it from every cover. Richard Peterson became a local legend. He was the poster boy for the boom. He used the equity in his original farm and the newly acquired Henderson Place to buy another 300 acres. He traded in his year-old 4630 for 2 brand-new John Deere 8630s, massive 4-wheel drive articulated tractors that could pull a 12-bottom plow. He bought a new Gleaner combine with a corn head so wide it had to be escorted down the county roads. His operation was a gleaming, efficient, and deeply leveraged empire. He built a new house on a hill overlooking his land, a sprawling ranch-style home that looked like something out of a magazine. When he drove through town in his new Cadillac, people pointed him out as a man who knew how to make things happen. And Art Miller watched it all from the seat of his reclutched Farmall M. He had good years too. The high prices meant that even his modest yields brought in more money than he'd ever seen. The farm was profitable, wildly so. Sarah, keeping the books, showed him the numbers, her eyes shining with possibility. "Dad, look at this," she'd say, spreading the ledger on the kitchen table. "We could pay off the whole farm mortgage this year, or we could use this as a down payment on the old Johnson farm. It's for sale. We could double our acreage overnight. We could finally buy a new tractor. For cash." But Art was unmovable. He took the profits and did something that seemed, in the frenzy of the times, like madness. He paid off the last of the farm's mortgage, a debt his own father had taken on 30 years prior. He held a mortgage-burning party with just him and Sarah, a quiet, solemn affair in the front yard. He took the rest of the money, and, instead of buying land or iron, he bought certificates of deposit at the bank, locking in the high interest rates that inflation had wrought. He fixed the barn roof. He rewired the house. He built up his defenses. To the rest of the county, he was no longer just a stubborn old man. He was a failure. A man who, when handed a golden opportunity, had buried his talent in the ground instead of making it grow. He had a paid-for farm, yes, but it was a small farm, an inefficient farm, a relic in an age of giants. The pitying looks in town turned to looks of quiet contempt. One evening in the late fall of 1979, Art was at the co-op getting a hydraulic hose repaired for his 4020. Rich Peterson was there, holding court with a group of younger farmers, all of them disciples of the new way of farming. "Variable rates, that's the key," Peterson was saying, leaning against a pallet of seed bags. The bank gives me a line of credit at prime +1. Sure, prime is high right now, but it'll come down. And with the tax write-offs on the interest and the depreciation on the new equipment, it's like the government is paying me to get bigger. You'd be a fool not to borrow every dime they'll give you. Art paid for his hose and walked past the group. Peterson saw him and called out, a mocking edge to his voice. "Hey, Art, heard you're making a killing off those CDs at the bank. You should get into the banking business instead of farming." The other farmers chuckled. Art didn't turn around. He just kept walking toward the door. As he pushed it open, he heard one of the younger men ask Peterson, "What do you think Prime will get up to, anyway?" "Who knows?" Peterson answered with a wave of his hand. 12, maybe 13%. Doesn't matter. Corn's $4 a bushel. It'll all work out. Art stepped out into the cold November air. The wind carried the first hint of winter, a sharp, biting promise of hardship to come. He looked up at the darkening sky and felt a deep, unshakable dread settle in his bones. In the papers, he'd been reading about a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man who had declared a war on inflation, a war he intended to win no matter the cost. Prime interest rate, variable rates. Those words echoed in Art's mind. Peterson and the others, they saw it all as a game, a set of numbers on a ledger. They didn't see the chain hidden inside the loan documents. They didn't feel the cold, heavy weight of it. But Art did. He felt it like a change in the weather, a drop in the barometer that foretold a storm of unimaginable fury just over the horizon. The first sign of the coming storm was not in the sky, but on the television screen. In January of 1980, the president announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn prices, which had flirted with $4 a bushel, plummeted to $2.50 and were still falling. It was all anyone at the co-op could talk about. The air, which had buzzed with the excitement of expansion and easy credit, now hung thick with a nervous, uncertain silence. Art saw the fear in men's eyes, the tight set of their jaws. They were like pilots who had flown high into a clear sky, only to have the engines cut out without warning. For Art, the news was a blow, but not a fatal one. His cost of production was low. He'd make less money, but he'd still make some. For Richard Peterson, it was the first tremor in the foundation of his empire. He had forward contracted his entire crop at the old high prices, but his operating loan for the next season was predicated on that same income. The bank was already getting nervous. Then the sky turned against them. The spring of 1980 was dry, and the summer that followed was a scorcher. The rains refused to come. The corn in Art's fields, planted in soil he had nurtured for decades, curled its leaves during the heat of the day to conserve moisture, but its roots ran deep. It survived, stunted and stressed, but it would make a crop. On Peterson's land, it was a different story. Much of the ground he'd bought was farmed out, its organic matter depleted by years of aggressive tillage. The corn there yellowed and withered. The vast, uniform fields that had been a symbol of his success now looked like a monument to his vulnerability. One blistering afternoon in July, Art was cultivating his soybeans with his old 4220, the open station providing no relief from the suffocating heat. He saw one of Peterson's massive 8630s sitting idle in the middle of a field, a dark green island in a sea of dusty brown. A service truck from the John Deere dealership was parked beside it. Art watched for a moment as a young mechanic in a clean uniform fiddled with something near the tractor's complex articulation joint. Later that week, he saw the mechanic again, this time at the diner in town. The kid looked exhausted. Art sat a few stools down and ordered a coffee. "Tough day?" Art asked, nodding a greeting. The kid sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not kidding, Mr. Miller. I've been out at the Peterson place all week. One of his 8630s blew a hydraulic pump. Not the main pump, mind you, but the regulated pressure pump that runs the steering and brakes. It's buried deep inside the transmission housing." He shook his head. "We had to split the tractor. Not like your old M. This thing is 2 giant halves of a computer-designed chassis. Took 2 of us a whole day just to get it apart. The pump itself is a $3,000 part, and it has to come from the factory in Moulins. Might be another week." Art stirred his coffee. A week without his main tillage tractor? In this heat. "Tell me about it," the kid said. "And Mr. Peterson, he's not a happy customer. He was yelling about the cost, about the downtime. Said for what he paid for that machine, it ought to be gold-plated." The kid lowered his voice. "Between you and me, the bill for the labor and the part is going to be close to $5,000. And his other 8630 has a turbo that's starting to whine. That's another $2,000 waiting to happen." Art finished his coffee and laid $1 on the counter. He thought of the clutch job on his farmall. It had cost him a week of his own labor and less than $200 in parts. He had known every bolt, every spring. Peterson didn't own his machines, he merely operated them. The dealership, the bank, the factory in Moulins, they were the true owners. They held the knowledge, the parts, the debt. Peterson was just the man in the driver's seat, and the ride was getting rough. The cracks began to show everywhere. Peterson, who once held court at the co-op, was now rarely seen. When Art did see him, the man's easy confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. His new Cadillac was traded for a used Ford pickup. There were rumors he'd missed a payment on his land contract for the Johnson place. The variable interest rate on his loans, which had seemed like a clever tool during the boom, was now a guillotine hanging over his head. Paul Volcker's war on inflation was in full swing, and the prime rate, which Peterson had casually dismissed at 13%, was now climbing past 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 20%. Every percentage point was another turn of the screw, another $1,000 a month in interest payments that produced nothing, bought nothing, only fed the insatiable appetite of the bank. The very leverage that had built his kingdom was now tearing it apart, piece by piece. The winter of 1981 was bleak. The price of corn stayed in the cellar, while the cost of everything else, fuel, fertilizer, parts, continued to rise. The term cash flow became a desperate prayer on every farmer's lips. For Art, it was tight. He and Sarah went over the books at the kitchen table, the numbers stark and unforgiving. But at the end of every column, there was no payment to the bank. The land was theirs. The machines were theirs. The income from his maturing CDs provided a small but critical buffer, a stream of cash in a desert of debt. "We'll be all right, Dad," Sarah said one night, her voice quiet but firm. She looked at the ledger, then at her father's worn hands. The shame she had felt after the tractor incident was long gone, replaced by a slow dawning, profound respect. She finally understood. He hadn't been resisting progress, he had been resisting servitude. The full collapse came in the spring of 1982. It wasn't a single event, but a cascade of failures. Land values, which had been the collateral for the mountain of debt the county's farmers had taken on, suddenly cratered. Land that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre was now struggling to sell for $1,000. Equity vanished into thin air. The banks, facing their own crisis, began calling in their loans. The polite letters turned into threatening ones, and the threatening letters were followed by foreclosure notices tacked to the doors of farmhouses up and down the gravel roads. Farm auctions became the social events of the season. Families stood in their own front yards, faces numb with shock, and watched as their lives were sold off, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. Neighbors who had helped each other for generations now bid against one another for a used disc or a half-empty fuel barrel, their own desperation overriding old loyalties. It was a brutal, heart-breaking spectacle. The biggest auction of all was Richard Peterson's. The sale bill was tacked up in the post office, a full page listing a staggering inventory of late-model equipment. 2 8630s, a Gleaner N6 combine with both a corn head and a grain platform, trucks, augers, planters, plows, and at the bottom of the list, in stark black letters, 480 acres, ML, of prime farmland, including the Richard Peterson homestead and the former Henderson Place. The day of the auction was cold and grey, the sky the colour of lead. Half the county was there, not out of spite, but out of a morbid curiosity, a need to witness the fall of the man who had flown the highest. Art and Sarah went too. They parked their old pickup a long way down the road and walked up the long driveway to the new house on the hill, the house Peterson had built at the peak of his fortunes. The machinery was lined up in neat, silent rows, gleaming green and silver against the brown, dormant fields. It looked like a dealer's lot. But the silence was wrong. These were machines meant to be working, to be roaring with power. Now, they were just assets, tagged with lot numbers, waiting to be liquidated. Art saw Peterson standing near the machine shed, talking to the banker. He looked like a stranger in his own yard. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and drawn. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by forces he couldn't control, leaving only a hollowed-out man. He caught Art's eye for a moment, and in that glance, Art saw not a rival, but a fellow farmer who had lost his way. There was no triumph in it, only a deep, profound sorrow for the dream that had died. Art weathered the storm. While his neighbors were selling off land to pay the interest on their loans, he was living off his savings and the modest income from his crops. His old Farmall M, patched and greasy, became a symbol of his survival. It sipped gasoline, its parts were cheap, and when it broke down, Art could fix it with the tools in his own shed. His 40-on-20 handled the heavier work. He was a small, self-contained island of solvency in an ocean of bankruptcy. He didn't get rich, he didn't expand, he simply endured. And in the 1980s farm crisis, endurance was the only victory that mattered. Sarah watched it all, her business school education being replaced by a real-world lesson in economics that was far more brutal and far more valuable. She saw the wisdom in the calloused hands, the logic in the old, slow way of doing things. The farm wasn't just a business, it was a lifeboat. And her father, stubborn and steadfast, was the man who had built it strong enough to ride out the flood. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant echoed across the yard, a funeral dirge for a fallen empire. They sold the small items first, shop tools, fuel tanks, spare tires. Then came the big machinery, the Gleaner combine, which Peterson had paid over $100,000 for just 3 years earlier, sold for $35,000. One of the giant 8630s went for a quarter of its original price. It was a bloodbath. The buyers were mostly out-of-state investors and large-scale operators from other counties who had managed to stay afloat, vultures picking over the bones. Art just watched, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. He wasn't there to gloat or to buy. He was there to bear witness. Then the auctioneer moved to the parcels of land. They started with the 80 acres of the old Henderson Place, the very first piece of land Peterson had bought in his expansion. It was good, flat, black ground, and it lay directly adjacent to Art's South 80. "All right, folks, here's a prime piece of ground," the auctioneer called out. 80 acres, lays flat, tiled well. Who'll start the bidding for me at $1,000 an acre?" The crowd was quiet. $1,000 an acre was still a lot of money when corn was barely breaking $2. An investor from Illinois opened the bidding. A local lawyer, buying for a client, countered. They went back and forth, the price inching up slowly. Sarah looked at her father. "Dad?" she whispered. Art's eyes were fixed on the land. He knew every swale, every soil type in that field. He'd watched old man Henderson farm it his whole life. It was good land, honest land. "$1,200 an acre," the auctioneer called. "Do I hear $1,250? The lawyer shook his head. The investor from Illinois looked confident. "Sold, then, for $1,200 and $1,250, a quiet voice said. Heads turned. It was Art Miller. A murmur went through the crowd. Art Miller, the man who never spent a dime, was bidding on land. The investor from Illinois looked annoyed. $1,300. $1,350, Art said, his voice a little stronger now, clear and steady in the cold air. He didn't look at the investor. He looked at the land. They went back and forth, the bids climbing in $50 increments. The crowd was silent, watching the duel between the out-of-state money and the old-timer who had been there all along. Finally, at $1,500 an acre, the investor threw his hands up in disgust and walked away. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, pointing his gavel at Art, to Mr. Arthur Miller for $120,000. Sarah stared at her father, her mouth open. He had never had that kind of money. Then she remembered. The CDs, the profits from the boom years, saved and invested, earning interest while everyone else's assets were collapsing. He had been waiting, not for Peterson to fail, but for the right opportunity, on his own terms. When the auction was over, Art walked to the clerk's trailer. He didn't arrange financing. He wrote a check for the full amount from his savings account. As he walked back to his truck, he saw Richard Peterson leaning against a fence post, a solitary figure watching the last of his life being driven away. Art walked over to him. There was no animosity left, only the shared, weary understanding of men who worked the soil. "Rich," Art said quietly. Peterson didn't look at him. "Come to tell me you told me so, Art?" "No," Art said. "I came to say I'm sorry this happened. You were a good farmer. You listened to the wrong people." Peterson finally turned, and Art saw the glint of tears in his eyes. "They told me I was a fool if I didn't borrow. The banker, the magazines, everyone. Said I had to get big or get out." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Well, I got big, and now I'm out." "The Henderson 80, Art said, changing the subject. "It's good land. I'll need a hand getting it ready for spring planting. If you're looking for work." Peterson stared at him, stunned by the offer of charity, of grace. He shook his head. "Thanks, Art, but I can't. My wife and we're moving to Des Moines. She's got a sister there. I'm going to try and get a job selling cars." He looked down at his hands that were shaped by a lifetime of farming. "Can you believe that?" "Selling cars." Art just nodded. There was nothing more to say. He offered his hand. Peterson took it, his grip surprisingly strong. "You were right, Art," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All along you were right." Life settled into a new rhythm. The Miller farm, now larger by 80 acres, prospered in the slow recovery of the late 1980s. Art farmed the new ground with his old equipment, taking his time, building up the soil just as he had his own. The whispers in town had long since died, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. Men who had once mocked his old farmel now came to him asking how to rebuild a carburetor or set the timing on a magneto. The old ways, the ones that relied on a man's own skill and not a bank's line of credit, were valuable once more. Sarah married a good local boy who loved the land as much as she did, and he came to work alongside Art. They bought another 40 acres, this time for cash they had saved together. They had a son, and they named him Arthur. One warm autumn afternoon, years later, Art was in the machine shed. He was old now, his movements slow and deliberate, his hands gnarled with arthritis. But he was still working. Little Art, who was about 10 years old, stood on a stool beside him, watching intently. They weren't working on a new, complex machine. They were working on the 1951 Farmall M. "Now watch," old Art said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He pointed a greasy finger at the distributor. "The points have to be gapped just right. Too wide, you get a weak spark. Too close, they'll burn up." He showed the boy how to use the feeler gauge, how to loosen the screw and gently tap the plate into position. "You feel that? Just a little bit of drag. That's what you want." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with concentration. He was learning more than mechanics. He was learning a philosophy. Sarah stood at the wide door of the machine shed, watching them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The smell of old oil and iron was the smell of her childhood, the smell of her family's survival. She looked at her father, his back bent over the old red tractor, and her son, his face a perfect mirror of youthful curiosity. The groan of old steel was the sound of her father's life. It was the sound of hardship and stubbornness, of ridicule and vindication. But now, as she listened to the quiet murmur of her father's voice, explaining the inner workings of the simple, reliable machine, she heard a new note in it. It was the sound of a legacy being passed, a quiet promise that the Miller farm, built on a foundation of paid-for steel and hard-won wisdom, would endure.